I mentioned at the beginning that the lectionary takes us to the end of the church year by focusing on events that might come at the end of time, or the parousia, as some call it, but the events that happen not only because of the end of Jesus' life, but the great end. And so all the readings in the last few weeks have been focused on that, and will culminate in next week's reading from the Gospel of Matthew. I chose this reading today out of Deuteronomy for a couple of reasons. One, if we place it in the historical context, we are in the middle of the time between the fall of the northern kingdom as a result of the assault of the Assyrians on the kingdom of Israel, and the looming destruction of the southern kingdom, Judea or Judah, by the Babylonians. We're in a time period roughly around, let's say, about 620, somewhere around there before the Common Era, when Josiah is king. And the reign of Josiah was a bright spot in the history of Judah. A bright spot in the sense that Josiah, at the urging of the prophet Jeremiah, seeks to restore the credibility and integrity of the people of Israel, or the people of the kingdom of Judah. In the way that it meant that they were to go back to observing the ways of God. It seems as Jeremiah and the prophet Isaiah and the other prophets before them, that Israel had lost its way, that it had built fine monuments on the backs of the people. It had co-opted the solid position of God as the only God in Israel by allowing the worship of other gods to come into the land. And basically, people were not paying attention anymore to what the Torah was about or what the way of God was about. And so the way that you tried to restore this was to remind people of where they had come from. What was before this time, the contrast, and sort of like what I experienced in India, the stark contrast between the wealthy and the poor is even greater than we could ever imagine here in the United States. And so it was true in ancient Israel as well, that the contrast between those who had made a living off the backs of the people and off the land, and the people who were now basically sharecroppers, or even worse, had nothing, had no land, had no food, had no nothing, didn't have anything. And so this stark contrast leads the prophets to say, well, the reason we're in this place is precisely because we've not kept to the way of God. We've not kept to the vision of God. We've not followed not just commandments, but we're not living a life of integrity and dignity in accord with the Torah. That's why we are in the place that we are. And so with that in mind, Deuteronomy is written around that time, around 620 before the Common Era, but it's really describing the moment in time back further when the people of Israel, having just come out of slavery, wandering in the desert for 40 years, because nobody could take the time to ask for directions of how to get out of Sinai. I mean, if they would have just asked Miriam, they would have gotten out of Sinai, right? But no, men never take directions and never ask for directions, and Moses and Aaron had to wander the people around in the desert for 40 years. But in any event, they get finally to the Jordan River. Moses stands on the top of Mount Nebo, and it's really powerful to stand on Mount Nebo today and look down across the Jordan River Valley. And if it's a clear day, which is hardly ever, you could actually see the tall towers of the city of Jerusalem from Mount Nebo. So that means that it's not more than 40 or 50 miles across from Mount Nebo to Jerusalem itself, on the other side of the Mount of Olives. Moses stands there and has already been told that he's not going to get to enter the promised land because he just was stubborn and arrogant and hard-hearted. And so God says, it's not for you to enter the promised land, it's rather for the next generation to enter the promised land. Everybody would have their vines and fig trees, and everything would be just hunky-dory. It would be the most wonderful place in all the world. In other words, the suggestion is that if this is the most wonderful place in all the world, why would you want anything else? God has provided this for you. Why would you want to have anything else? Why would anything else tempt you to give all of this up? And so that's kind of the background feeling to the text. And so, but you see what happens is that from the time that Israel actually crosses the Jordan and enters into the land, you can read the book of Judges that it's one conflict after another, one war after another, that Israel is in constant fighting. The book of Judges tells us that all these peoples that they've entered into the midst of, that now there has to be a conquest of the land. Sounds familiar, doesn't it, in many ways? That a conquest takes place where Israel is in conflict with all these people, trying to secure for themselves this land of promise, meaning it's really not a land of promise. I mean, it doesn't look like this description at all. It's pretty devastated. It's pretty bleak. It's pretty barren. Why? Because the peoples that lived there didn't take the time to, create agriculture, build cities, and so forth. Anyway, that's a whole nother issue. So when they get there, the actual history tells us that it takes them roughly from about 1200 before the Common Era all the way up to the time of David, almost 300 years to settle in the land of promise. So from Moses to at least King Saul, or more specifically David, it takes about 300 years for them to begin to establish the kingdom that God had intended them on creating. Well, in the meantime, you could just imagine that if you read in the book of Samuel about King Saul and even the beginnings of King David, is that they were already violating everything that God had said, that if you violate, it's going to be bad for you. They were already violating that. They were already allowing the worship of other gods. They were already, just think of Solomon. Solomon had something like 30 wives, and you can imagine, as kings are wont to do, that kings married the daughters of their enemies, so that as the daughter of the enemy comes into the royal palace, she has to bring in all her gods and all her servants and everything, so that right in the palace of King Solomon are whole pockets of worshiping foreign gods, whole pockets of different kinds of, well, you could just imagine, right, how that's working out. It's not working out good at all. And so that's what the prophets speak to. We were told not to violate this command of God, that when we enter the land, we are to keep our focus on the way of God, because it is that way of God that liberated us from slavery in Egypt, and it will be that way of God that will create this land that we believe is the promised land. And already you've done everything against it. So that by the time of the book of Deuteronomy, thinking back, using that as a metaphor, isn't that kind of true? That oftentimes we glamorize the past to make it sound like the past is better than the present. Every once in a while it'll pop up on Facebook. Oh, for the simpler days. Yeah, right. What one of us would give up our microwaves, what one of us would give up our iPhone, what one of us would give up our TVs, what one of us would give up a washing machine and a dryer, for God's sake. Not one of us would give up any of that stuff. Oh, for the simpler life. Oh, yeah, right. Go without electricity and see how long that takes you, right? So that the simpler life always looks better only because of how we've complicated our lives in the present. Well, it doesn't have to be complicated in the present if we know that all those things are not to dominate us or to control us, but rather we're to dominate them and use them. Yeah, right. How long do we spend on Facebook or on the media? It really does dominate us, right? Steve is always saying to me, if you get so upset about the news, just stop watching the news. Well, I can't stop watching the news because I want to know what's going on in the world. Well, that just makes me more angry and more upset. Oh my God, it's like a vicious circle, right? And there we are in a vicious circle that the past is glamorized, but was never simpler or never better, but then that colors the way that we live in the present. And by the way, right, what does it do to the future? It makes the future look even more impossible, more distant, and it makes the future like, that we want easy, quick solutions to more complicated problems. This past week, I gave a presentation to a group of people on the Middle East, like they wanted to know, because the media isn't always giving them enough information to understand what's going on in the conflict between Hamas and the state of Israel. And so I tried, I was already 20 minutes over the time that they had allotted me, because there's just so much that has to be taken into account. So that going forward, they all realize at the end that it's not going to be easy to go forward, because there's not going to be an easy solution to the situation because of all this complicated history and all the investments that both sides have made into extremism in some way or another. So there is the book of Deuteronomy. And the reason why I bring this in for today in terms of Thanksgiving is that it seems that embedded in this story, as much as in the American story, right? Because I remember back early in my Protestant ministry of thinking that the story of the Pilgrims was so wonderful, right? Only because maybe being associated with the United Church of Christ, that was kind of the origin of the United Church of Christ. And I thought this was great. That's the story that we're all told. It used to be the story all of us were told, right? Well, what do we think about that story today? We called it into question, haven't we? Why? Because what does that story, that narrative of the Pilgrims eventually lead to? Genocide, the extermination of the native peoples, right? Wow. Is that the story that our country is founded upon? It's the story that you hear frequently in politics, right? What is it? On the shining hill. What's that phrase? The city on the hill. That it becomes the promised land, right? Because we know that the narrative all the way back into England, that the Pilgrims themselves that they were under such persecution by the Anglican Church in England, that they had created this scenario and narrative and vision of a promised land where they would be free from oppression, free to practice their faith as they wish, and free from the domination of this larger culture that they were a minority in. And so they create a whole narrative that leads to this voyage across the sea to establish a promised land, a new promised land, thinking that this continent that they were going to were devoid of any life and any civilization, regardless of the fact that the native peoples living not only on the East Coast but in the Southwest and everywhere else had a much more ancient culture than even the Pilgrims had. But oh no, because it was so different and looked so different that it was totally dismissed. Steve and I always get into the argument. He says to me, thinking that I was the immigrant, meaning the German-Irish immigrant, he always says to me, and no offense, Steve, but he always says to me, my people were here before your people, because he's Mexican descent, out of Latino, Hispanic descent, and I go, your people? I said, your people were the ones who brought all the diseases and the extermination of the peoples. I said, excuse me, your people? Your people didn't benefit anything when it comes to the native peoples of the United States, right? Just think of the Spanish crown and cross, right? Sword and cross, exterminate, forced conversions, just like they were experiencing in Spain in the 15th century. I say all of that because embedded in not only the narrative that's being told here in Deuteronomy, given both that reflection back, remember back there, we were told what we needed to do, but here we are now in the midst of exactly what we were told would happen. How do we get out of this in terms of this? Well, the idea is stop thinking that you're the one who is the creator of the world. It says, if you think you've accomplished all this, build these big cities, build these highways, build industry, right? There's several programs on the History Channel. You know, the people that built America, the foods that built America, the captains of industry that built America, as if they are the ones who've created America. Well, how did they create what it is? By the people that did all the work for them, right? The Carnegies and the Rockefellers and all those people. The only reason why they rose to the position that they are because there were people doing the work that they told to do the work. Well, how can you possibly ever think that in the midst of that there can be any sense of thankfulness and gratitude? Oh, thank you, Mr. Rockefeller, for making yourself so rich and powerful. And oh, by the way, now I've got gasoline for my car. Isn't that wonderful? Thank you, Mr. Ford, for creating cars that I can drive freely around on the highways and byways of America. Where in the midst of all of that is any sense that how we got here was not through our own means, although it often is the narrative, but how we got here was somehow because of, well, now I'm not sure I can make this jump or this leap, that for Israel, let me put it back into them, how they are in the position that they are is because they made choices that were contrary to the vision of God. How they get out of it is to restore the centrality of God in their life and in their whole way of being in community. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that move, but you see, the point is that did they liberate themselves or did God liberate them? Did they reach the point that they're at through their own efforts separate from God, or did they do it because they were being faithful and committed to God? And that's what they need to consider to be thankful for. Is it thankful for the material realities of our lives that matter? Or is it thankful that somehow or another we have a vision and a sense of purpose and meaning that is not built on materialism and capitalism and self-centeredness, but rather on a sense of community and a sense of relationships and the importance of relationships? Is that what the life is built upon? Well, if you stick strictly to the scripture, it's that. It's the relationships and community and the strength of the way that we live in unity or in harmony or in community with each other, and the willingness that we have to share what we have with each other. That's really what community is built on. The last night that we were in Jaipur was the night of Diwali, was the big celebration in India of their New Year's and all kinds of stuff that goes along with that. And we actually went to dinner in a family's home that they've created out of their home that their family has lived in that location over 400 years. Imagine that. And the home that they were living in was built by the husband's great-grandfather. And at that point, the house had over 18 bedrooms attached to it. And the reason why it had 18 bedrooms along the way that any of the extended family had any problems or needs, this house was the place that they could come to and feel welcome at and feel accepted and could live in safety and security. And she said that. She said it wasn't so much me, the wife, marrying into his family. It was him now trying to deal with my family in such a way that he had to be as committed to her family as she was committed to his family. And she said that when anybody in the family needed anything or was in a problem, that they immediately went because there was an important connection between the extended family and them. And I had to sit there for a minute, and I think the whole group kind of went, well, that sounds like that's how it should be. And yet, thinking as Americans, I'm not sure. Some families, maybe that's how it is. But for the most part, that's not how it happens for us. How many stories we hear. There was a lady, I heard it again on the news today, one of the people that had been homeless down in the zone downtown. And they moved her into a place, and that was not a place she wanted to be. She wanted to be back there in the zone. And she said, I worked in the medical field for 31 years. I lost everything. I have nothing. I have no family. And this was the only place that I felt was home for me. Wow. In this country, built as it is, that somebody at her age, with her experience, that the only place she feels comfortable and safe is in the zone. Do we not feel any obligation or responsibility to bring that person into our community, integrate them in such a way that they are recognized, held with dignity and respect and honored? For 31 years of experience in the medical field, that's where she ends up? I'm already gone too long, and I guess after not preaching for 2 weeks, you've got a whole lot of stuff to say. Because I wanted to give the opportunity, and I want to twist it a little bit towards where Chalice is at this moment. I tried to give the idea that the past, there's great things that happened for you in the past. But that's the past. The future lies ahead of you. So what is it in the present moment that you can be thankful for that will enable this community to move forward? Because that's where Israel is at in the book of Deuteronomy. Can they move forward in such a way to restore the life of their community? Can they move forward? Will they be able to move forward? And the suggestion is the only way that you can move forward for Deuteronomy is to remember that it is God who has brought you to this point. If you can't remember that, then it's not going to work. If you can remember it, then indeed all of these blessings that are right now ideals may come about for you. But you have to make that commitment. You have to be as invested in that commitment of thankfulness for where you are at the present moment in order to be able to invest in the future. So I want to ask you, what do you want to give thanks for in your life, in your family life, in this community's life? What do you want to truly give thanks for where you are at this moment? Thinking of the past, but also looking to the future. What can you be thankful for at this moment in your life, in your family's life, in this community's life? So just think about it. Give the introverts time to think about it. I want you to respond to this question. Yes, no.
I feel a strong yet very grounded group of people that are willing to work together, to move together to whatever the future will bring.
So a thankfulness for a group of people that is willing to make that step. Yep. Yes. And then just pass it around, David.
I'm thankful that we have had and continue to have and are holding as a central tenet of who we are, the vision of being, I don't exactly want to use this phrase, but a light in the darkness, a place of light within, for some people, within a community where they don't see the light.
I think for me, one of the things I've come to understand is clarity of what our purpose is. I think we look at maybe a building, we look at different aspects of religion, and now we're understanding better what our purpose is, our outreach, and our effect on other people, not just our congregation.
Thanks, Jerry.
So I think we have a group of people that are really trying to understand intellectually and emotionally how to move forward and how to bring good news to the world.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Bill.
I'm very thankful that we are driven by our mission and by our sort of pillars of existence. So, you know, we talk about questions being important, and you see the questions that the kids respond to in Worship and Wonder. That's questions are important. We have a book study where we have, you know, people ask questions. People can say, I don't believe in this, or I think this is wrong, or what does this mean? And I just think that's very powerful, and we're radically hospitable, meaning, you know, we had a symposium a long time, you talk about in the past, we had a symposium about marriage equality before the Supreme Court had the case that decided marriage equality. We sponsored General Assembly Resolution 1327, which is calling for all disciples' churches to be open and affirming. We are radically hospitable, and that's a core value that we, I think, take forward into the future. And we do care about impacting the world. Like, we're a pretty small church to still be doing iHelp once a month. And, you know, we care about, so I'm very thankful to have a group that the most important things are the most important things. And I think that I'm thankful to have the opportunity to bring that forward into the future.
Thanks, Jim. It's interesting, for one final point, it's interesting in talking with a young Indian while I was there, to come to find out that transgender people in India have legal status. 2014, transgender people were given legal status as a third gender within India. Imagine that. With as strong of the religious community as the Hindus, the Muslims, the Sikhs, the Buddhists, the Jains, and the Christians are, that as a nation, they are even ahead of where we are. And we're trying to prevent transgender people from health care and preventing them from the support and encouragement that they need. It's interesting. It doesn't mean that there's not prejudice against them. There is tremendous amounts of prejudice, especially in the very conservative religious communities, a lot of prejudice. But this young Indian said, he said, after all, you know, that the Hindu god, Brahma, has several female avatars. And so rooted in the Hindu understanding of divinity is indeed not only male and female, but transgender. And he said, and that's why we can hold what we hold. Their God is almost more inclusive than our God. And so it's a challenge to think that a lot of work ahead for Chalice, a lot of work, and talk more about that next week. A lot of work just to go beyond just thinking this is a safe place. That it also has to be thankful for the opportunity to create a larger safe place within the world in which we live. And that's absolutely critical for the future, not only as a church, as a congregation, but as people in the United States, to be thankful for this opportunity to create a larger inclusive space within our community.